In September 2001, the United States faced one of the darkest moments in its history. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon killed thousands of people and left the whole nation in grief and fear. While Americans were still trying to understand and recover from those terrible events, another kind of terror appeared. Quiet, invisible, and deadly. It came not from planes or bombs, but through the ordinary mail. This new threat became known as the Anthrax attacks, or the Anthrax case. Only a week after the September 11th attacks, several letters began arriving at offices of journalists and U.S. senators. The envelopes looked normal, but inside was a fine white powder. The powder contained anthrax spores, a kind of bacteria that can cause a very serious and often deadly disease. When people opened these letters, the tiny spores floated into the air, and those who breathed them in became seriously ill. This second wave of fear struck a nation already on edge. People who had survived the shock of 9/11 now faced a new kind of terror, one that could come quietly through the mail, without warning or explosion, and kill without leaving a visible trace. Anthrax is a disease caused by bacteria called Bacillus anthracis. In nature, it usually affects farm animals like sheep, goats, and cows. Humans can get infected by touching, eating, or breathing in the spores. Most cases in history had been linked to farm work or handling animal products, but anthrax can also be turned into a biological weapon. Anthrax spores are very small, hard, and long-lasting. They can survive in soil or on surfaces for many years. When inhaled, they attack the lungs and can cause high fever, difficulty breathing, and shock. Without quick medical care, the infection is often fatal. Scientists have long worried that anthrax could be used as a weapon, but before 2001, such an attack had never happened on a large scale in the United States. The first known victim was Robert Stevens, a photo editor at The Sun, a newspaper in Florida. On October 4, 2001, he was hospitalized with a strange illness that doctors soon identified as inhalation anthrax. Despite treatment, he died shortly after. This shocked health officials because such cases were extremely rare. At first, many believed it was just an accident or a natural infection. But within days, other people began to get sick in different parts of the country. Journalists in New York and postal workers in Washington, D.C. started showing the same symptoms. Soon, it became clear that these were not accidents. Someone was deliberately sending anthrax through the mail. Investigators discovered several letters that contained the deadly powder. The first ones were sent to news organizations like NBC, CBS, ABC, and the New York Post. Later, 2 more letters were sent to U.S. Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. Each letter contained short, printed messages in capital letters. The words were chilling. 9/11/01, you cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. The use of religious language and the mention of September 11th made many people believe that this was the work of the same kind of extremists who had carried out the 9/11 attacks. But as time went on, it became clear that this might not be true. The phrase, Allah is great, is a beautiful and peaceful expression used by millions of people in their daily prayers. But here, it had been twisted and abused by the writer of the letters to create fear and hatred. This was a painful example of how people sometimes misuse religion for violent or hateful goals. The problem was not the religion itself, but the human choice to use its name for evil purposes. When the news of the anthrax letters became public, panic spread across the country. People became afraid to open their mail. Postal workers were terrified, and government offices were placed under strict security. Some buildings had to be closed and cleaned for weeks. The anthrax spores spread in post offices where the letters had passed through. 2 postal workers in Washington, D.C. died from inhalation anthrax after handling the contaminated mail. Several others fell seriously ill. Across the nation, people began reporting suspicious white powders in envelopes, though most turned out to be harmless. In total, 22 people were infected, and 5 of them died. The victims were from different walks of life: postal workers, journalists, and ordinary citizens. The attack showed how even a few grams of powder could spread fear through an entire nation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, launched a massive investigation called Anthrax. It became one of the largest and longest criminal cases in American history. At first, investigators thought that foreign terrorists might be responsible. The letters seemed to suggest a link to Islamic extremism, but as scientists examined the anthrax spores, they found that the strain used in the letters came from a U.S. government laboratory, not from another country. The anthrax was highly purified and carefully prepared. This meant that the person who made it had scientific training, access to secure lab equipment, and knowledge of biological weapons. This discovery changed the direction of the investigation completely. The FBI began looking closely at American scientists who worked with anthrax. In 2002, they focused on Dr. Stephen Hatfill, a virologist who had once worked at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, in Fort Detrick, Maryland. Hatfill had the right background and access to the type of anthrax used. Investigators searched his home, followed him everywhere, and leaked information to the press. He was labeled a person of interest, and the media treated him as if he were guilty. However, there was no solid evidence connecting Hatfill to the attacks. The FBI never charged him. Years later, he was completely cleared and even received a financial settlement from the government for the harm done to his reputation. His story became a warning about how fear and pressure can cause people to rush to judgment, destroying innocent lives. After Hatfill was cleared, the investigation turned toward another scientist at Fort Detrick, Dr. Bruce Ivins. Ivins was a respected microbiologist who had worked for years on developing vaccines against anthrax. He was known to be smart and dedicated, but also somewhat unstable and troubled in his personal life. The FBI found that Ivins had worked unusually late hours alone in the lab in the days before the letters were mailed. He also had access to the same kind of anthrax used in the attacks. Investigators discovered personal emails and behavior that suggested he was under emotional stress. As the investigation continued, Ivins became the main suspect. He was questioned many times and knew that he might soon be charged. In July 2008, before he could face trial, Ivins took his own life by swallowing a large dose of painkillers. A few weeks later, the FBI announced that the case was solved. They declared that Bruce Ivins had acted alone and was the person who mailed the anthrax letters. Even though the FBI closed the case, many people were not convinced. Scientists who studied the evidence said that it was not strong enough to prove Ivins's guilt beyond doubt. Some of his co-workers said that he could not have made such highly refined anthrax on his own. Others believed he was mentally unwell and that the pressure of the investigation had pushed him to despair. Independent experts later reviewed the FBI's scientific evidence and found it inconclusive. They agreed that the anthrax came from the Fort Detrick lab, but they could not prove that Ivins was the one who sent it. The case left many unanswered questions. Was Ivins really guilty? Could someone else have done it? Was there more than one person involved? Because Ivins died before trial, there was never a chance for a full court examination of the evidence. The anthrax attacks did not just kill 5 people. They changed the way Americans thought about safety. The idea that ordinary letters could carry deadly germs made everyone feel vulnerable. For months, people were afraid to open their mail. Government buildings and postal centers installed new machines to screen for biological threats. Billions of dollars were spent on improving national defenses against bioterrorism. The attacks also raised moral questions about human behavior. Why would someone use scientific knowledge, meant to save lives, to create fear and death? It showed how science, like religion, can be used for both good and evil, depending on human choices. Some people use religion to guide them toward kindness and peace, while others misuse it to justify violence or revenge. The same is true of science. It can heal or harm, depending on who controls it and why. The Anthrax attacks became a painful lesson about what happens when intelligence and belief are twisted by hatred or fear. The months following the attacks were filled with anxiety. The U.S. government spent hundreds of millions of dollars cleaning contaminated buildings and testing mail. Thousands of people were given antibiotics just in case they had been exposed. The fear also created division. Many people began to suspect foreigners or people of certain backgrounds, even when they had nothing to do with the attacks. This suspicion showed how easily fear can turn into prejudice. It was another example of how human beings, when afraid, sometimes allow anger and blame to replace understanding and truth. The Anthrax attacks taught several important lessons. First, they showed that terrorism does not always come from outside enemies. Sometimes it can come from within, carried out by individuals who live and work among us. Second, they reminded people that violence done in the name of religion or ideology is not truly religious. No faith teaches people to harm the innocent. When individuals commit evil acts and then claim to represent a religion, they are only using faith as an excuse for their own hatred or power. Third, the case showed the importance of careful, honest investigation. The rush to find someone to blame led to mistakes that destroyed innocent lives. True justice takes time, patience, and respect for truth. Finally, the attacks revealed how fragile modern societies can be. Even a few letters caused massive fear and chaos. This led governments to strengthen systems for disease detection, emergency communication, and mail safety. The 2001 anthrax attacks were one of the most mysterious and frightening crimes in modern American history. They came just weeks after 9/11, when the nation was already wounded and fearful. 5 people lost their lives, 17 others were made seriously ill, and millions more lived in fear. The investigation focused first on one scientist, then another. The final suspect, Bruce Ivins, died before the truth could ever be proven in court. Although the FBI closed the case, many questions remain. To this day, the full story may never be known. But beyond the mystery lies a deeper truth about humanity. When fear, anger, or the misuse of religion or science leads people to harm others, it shows how easily good intentions can be lost. The anthrax letters were not just about bacteria or mail. They were about human choices. Choices to spread fear instead of hope, and death instead of understanding. The story of the anthrax attacks is therefore not only a tale of crime and investigation, but also a reminder. It reminds us that real strength does not come from terror or revenge, but from compassion, truth, and the courage to do what is right, even in the face of fear.